The military changes in the Byzantine Empire during the 10th century greatly and permanently altered fighting in the Near East. The Byzantines created catapults that shot burning missiles filled with the famous Greek fire. Their new heavy cavalry usually bested the enemy cavalry in well-coordinated charges and added much-needed offensive punch to the army, while the infantry was deployed in a big, hollow, square shape that provided support and refuge in case of a counterattack. This new war machine was meant to lead the empire into a better future. However, the journey to that success was long. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, experienced a time of cultural and military decline, often called the Byzantine Dark Ages. The Byzantine Empire started to settle in the 9th century after many years of fighting within itself and losing battles. This was largely because the Byzantine army was well organized into combat areas called themes and had professional units known as tagmata. However, it did not have a strong ability to attack. This offensive insufficiency stood in sharp contrast to the ambitions of the emperors. They wanted to take the fight to the Bulgars in the north and the Muslim states in the south. This strategy required a better trained army that could be more effective in combat. It requested changes to the troops. In this video, we will discuss 3 key changes that transformed the Byzantine army and helped the empire enter a new period of prosperity. The Byzantine Empire needed more reliable and more professional troops, organized in a way that would allow them to operate effectively and aggressively on offensive campaigns. This was achieved by 3 major reforms. First, reviving a core of disciplined, effective line of battle, infantry that could confront enemy infantry and cavalry, back their own cavalry march long distances, and function as garrison troops away from their home area on a permanent basis. Second, introducing a corps of heavily armored lancers that could operate in conjunction with the infantry, they increased the aggressive power of the Byzantine cavalry greatly and added much punch to its attack. This is often referred to as the return of the Cataphract. Third, using Greek fire in pitched fights by deploying handheld pumping devices and grenades filled with the Incendiary. However, only very little knowledge has come down to us about this last change. In general, we can track these changes mainly through a series of treatises on strategy and tactics written in the 10th century, although they don't go into too much detail. These primary sources show that most of those major changes were finished by the 960s and 970s, but they had started much earlier. Generally speaking, infantry used to play a secondary part in the Byzantine armies from the 6th to the 9th century, both tactically and numerically. But by the 10th century, this changed greatly due to political and military alterations. Not only was it now thought more significant tactically, but it also outnumbered the cavalry almost 2 to 1. The new importance of infantry was stressed by placing it under a senior officer, the so-called obliturges, who was second to the commander-in-chief. He was responsible for the infantry's training field, discipline, and success in battle. Looking back to the proficient legions of the Roman Empire, which were still idealized by many Byzantine commanders, the focus of infantry training moved to discipline and drill. At the same time, the military role of infantry changed. The Byzantines understood the weakness of soldiers, especially when facing cavalry, and knew an increase in numbers and improvement in training alone wouldn't be enough. They adapted to this problem by deploying their foot troops in a hollow square or rectangle formation made up of 12 brigades, so-called taxiarchies. This was meant to prevent the infantry from being encircled by enemy cavalry, serve as a home base for their own cavalry in battle, and to prevent the infantry themselves from turning to flight. There was enough space between the blocks of this formation to allow the cavalry to easily leave and enter the square. These gaps were guarded by additional small infantry units. Hitherto, the infantry had been drawn up in a deep line with very limited offensive powers. In these lines, the taxiarches had been arranged like a phalanx, with 16 rows of spearmen backed up by 4 rows of archers. The new taxiarches, in contrast, were double-faced, 10 rows deep, with 4 rows of spearmen on either side and 2 rows of archers in the middle. This way, they could quickly change their front to either side. For example, if an enemy cavalry unit managed to enter the hollow square, they could defend their back simultaneously. A new kind of army is introduced. They were equipped with a so-called menoleon, a long spear that served a function similar to the medieval pike, operating independently from the rest of the taxi archi. They had the task to stop heavy cavalry attacks by advancing in front of the rest of the formation and draw up in a line or wedge to break up the charge. In case of a horse charge, the infantry reinforced its lines by moving the menautoi to the very front, while the backmost line of the regular infantry reinforced the front as well. By this, they increased the depth of the front from 4 to 6 lines. Very quickly, once the infantry had stopped the charge, Javeliners moved forward to attack them from the sides by about 965 AD. When the Praecepta Militaria, one of the treatises, was written, a taxi archi consisted of about 1,000 soldiers, with 400 spearmen, 300 archers, 200 light infantry, and 100 menoletoi. The new square formations were more mobile and able to work with the cavalry in new ways. Hitherto, the horsemen had worked from behind the infantry line. Now they started to fight in front of the infantry, but could always retreat into the hollow square, which served them as a refuge and mobile base. Deploying the infantry in this way also offered solidity and security in defense, a retreat for lighter troops and flexibility as the formation could be changed into a solid attacking formation quickly. According to the historian John Heldon, a quadrilateral formation was nothing new, as square formations had been used by the ancient Greeks and also the Romans when setting up camp, marching through hostile terrain, or in cases of emergency in general. Making this particular hollow square the standard formation, however, was an innovation. All these changes increased the infantry status. The focus on training and new field tactics initiated an improvement in morale, tactical cohesion, and battlefield discipline. At the same time, the use of mercenaries and the recruitment of high-quality infantry from among certain ethnic groups within the empire who had a reputation for being warlike became more important. Notably the Armenians, were considered the best infantry well into the 11th century. All this drastically improved the effectiveness and prestige of infantry. Still, it stayed lower in status than the cavalry, and its equipment was relatively poor. But it was professionalized very much, and probably closer resembled the disciplined Roman footmen than any Byzantine infantry in the previous 3 centuries. While this big change in the role of infantry was taking place, the cavalry of the empire was reformed as well. The standard mounted units which made up the bulk of the cavalry force were grouped in tactical units of 50 men, so-called banda. In battle, several of these banda were arrayed 8 to 10 rows deep, with varying width based on the army size. During the reforms in the late 9th and 10th century, Byzantine tacticians modified this formation several times until it was usually 100 men wide and only 5 men deep, with the first 2 and the last row made up of heavy cavalry, while the 3rd and 4th consisted of horse archers. So like the infantry, the horse formation was now double-faced, which made it more flexible too. Inevitably, the share of heavy troops and mounted archers changed as well. In addition, the cavalry units were complemented with a type of unit well known from previous times. The Cataphract made its reappearance. These heavily armed cavalrymen were clad in L.A. Meller armor, mail and quilting from head to toe. The Cataphracts were the best of the army and were, of course, extremely expensive in battle. They formed up a broad-nosed wedge, the so-called trigonos parataxis, and their main function was backed by the regular lancers and the other cavalry to smash through the enemy's heavy gallery or infantry line, break up their formation, and create an opening for the lighter cavalry, which would then try to turn the sides of the enemy lines. According to the Praecepta Militaria, a full wedge was 12 rows deep, with the first row being 20 ranks wide. The width increased by 4 men every row, so that the 12th had 64 men and a formation a total of 504. But these formations were not entirely made up of cataphracts. The middle of the group consisted of mounted archers. This formation was perfectly designed for shock attacks, as often discussed in our videos. Cavalry could have a hard time when charging into UN-disrupted infantry formations. It seems, however, that the Byzantine tacticians had well accounted for this. The trigonos parataxis was ideally suited for a charge in 3 steps. The mounted archers would send a hail of arrows into the enemy forces to open up gaps. Then the wedge charged into the enemy lines, for which the heavy cataphracts in the front were ideally suited. After first impact, they pressed forward in melee to cut their way through the enemy lines. Finally, if the attack worked, the archers in the back took over to pursue the retreating enemy. In addition, the military manuals of the 10th century described a change in the tactical deployment of the Byzantine cavalry. For centuries, the traditional way of deploying cavalry was to set up the full mounted force into two lines, along with the necessary units of flank guards, outflankers, and rearguard units. Apparently, the tacticians of the 10th century considered this unwieldy, unstable, and vulnerable to attacks from the side, and suggested adding a third line of cavalry. At least in some cases, this soccer or rearguard was to be equal with the first line in numbers, and thus reflects the efforts to make units double-faced on army level. Finally, there was a third important tactical change. This is best illustrated by a passage of the Praecepta Militaria addressing support weapons. It reads, quote, "The leader of the army should have with him small Cairo Magana and 3 Elikatia. These are both some sort of catapult, a swivel tube with liquid fire and a hand pump, so that if the enemy is using the same deployment in equal strength, our men can gain the upper hand over the foe and break them up by using the fake liquid fire." End quote. This is clearly a reference to the famous incendiary known as Greek fire. Greek fire was mainly used in naval and siege warfare by the Byzantines. And according to the historian Gargios Theotokos, this line in the Praecepta Militaria is actually the first mention of its using pitched battles by a land army. This was probably inspired by Muslim forces who had relied on devices to project incendiaries already in the 9th century, mostly in grenade-like containers that were thrown by hand or siege machines, depending on their size. These were used in the opening stages of a battle, along with archers. Now the Byzantines spread the use of Greek fire to land battles, at least to a small degree. Unfortunately, we don't know how exactly the Byzantine forces used the incendiary, which makes it hard to assess whether it caused much damage in the enemy ranks. It seems likely that it was deployed for psychological effect. The late 10th and 11th century showed how successful the Byzantine military reforms were. Thanks to the tactical changes, the Byzantine army had enough punch to reconquer a lot of the empire's former territory. Throughout the next decades, the emperors of the Macedonian dynasty were very successful on the attack, defeated most of their enemies, and led the Byzantine Empire to new prosperity in what has been dubbed the Byzantine Golden Age in